The first thing Detective Mara Hayes noticed was silence. It had replaced the screaming. Minutes earlier, neighbors had heard a woman cry out, followed by something heavy crashing against glass. Then came a man's voice, too muffled to understand, and finally nothing. Now the house stood beneath police lights, its tall windows reflecting red and blue across the wet street. Officer Daniel Reed pushed open the front door. Police. Anyone inside? No answer. The foyer smelled of perfume, spilled liquor, and blood. She stepped over a broken wine glass. Shoes were everywhere. Men's dress shoes, women's heels, a black jacket, and an open handbag lay scattered across the polished floor. This wasn't a quiet dinner, Reed said. Hayes followed the trail toward the living room. A woman lay motionless beside the coffee table. She was young, perhaps in her 30s, wearing a dark dress torn near the shoulder. Blood had spread across the pale rug beneath her head. Hayes stopped. "Ma'am?" she called, though she already knew. She crouched, checked for a pulse, and waited. Nothing. Hayes looked around. Crystal glasses covered the dining table. Champagne stood open beside them, while music played softly from a speaker, creating an obscene contrast with the body. Then she saw the man. He was sitting against the far wall. His name, she would later learn, was Ethan Cole. He looked less like a suspect than someone who had forgotten how to move. His white shirt was stained red at the cuffs. Blood marked his palms and one sleeve. He stared at the woman without blinking. "Sir," Hayes said, "can you tell me what happened?" Ethan looked at her. His lips trembled. "I didn't mean to." "What didn't you mean to do?" He looked toward the body. "I didn't mean to kill her." Hayes exchanged a glance with Reed. She had heard those words before. Sometimes they came from witnesses. More often, they came from people already trying to explain themselves. "What's your name?" "Ethan." "Ethan what?" "Cole." "Do you live here?" He nodded. "With the woman?" "My wife." Hayes stood slowly. She noticed details the first shock had hidden: a second phone beneath the sofa, a man's watch, 2 champagne glasses, and a woman's coat that did not belong to Claire. Upstairs, several bedroom doors stood open. The house was telling them that people had been here that night. People who had left in a terrible hurry, without looking back. Nobody cleaned up. "Ethan," Hayes said, keeping her voice calm. "Where is everybody else?" "I don't know." "Who was here tonight?" His breathing changed. Then, for the first time, something other than shock appeared on his face. Humiliation. Anger. Grief. "I came home early," he whispered. Hayes waited. Ethan looked at the blood on his hands. "And I found my wife at my boss's party," his voice broke. "In my house." Outside, another patrol car pulled to the curb. Inside, Hayes understood that the dead woman was only the beginning. She did not yet know whether Ethan Cole was a grieving husband, a murderer, or both. But before sunrise, she would need to discover who had been invited into this house, why they had come, and what had happened between the moment Ethan opened the front door and the moment Claire Cole stopped breathing. To understand how Ethan reached that room, investigators would later begin with the woman whose silence had lasted for years. 3 years before the police arrived at the house, Claire Cole still believed that appearances could protect a marriage. Their neighbors saw the Coles as fortunate. Ethan had a successful career, Claire had a respectable position of her own, and their house sat behind trimmed hedges on a quiet street where expensive cars disappeared into wide garages every evening. They traveled twice a year, hosted dinners, and smiled for photographs with the effortless confidence of people who seemed certain about their future. Nobody saw what happened after the front door closed. Claire had become careful about that. She learned which arguments could be postponed until morning and which ones had to disappear before guests arrived. She learned how to lower her voice when Ethan was angry, how to apologize without admitting fault, and how to smile when someone asked whether they were happy. "We're great," she would say. Sometimes Ethan answered for her. "We're better than great." Claire would smile. She had once loved that certainty in him. Later, it began to feel like a locked door. Ethan's suspicion had not appeared overnight. At first, it was small enough to dismiss. He asked why Claire had taken so long at the grocery store. He wanted to know who had called while she was showering. If she came home later than expected, he noticed. Then he started remembering details Claire wished he would forget. "You said you'd be home at 7. It was traffic. You could have called." "I was busy." "Busy for 2 hours?" The questions became arguments. The arguments became routines. Claire rarely shouted back. She had discovered that silence irritated Ethan less than disagreement, and keeping the peace gradually became more important than being understood. Then Ethan's career accelerated. His company promoted him into a senior position, placing him closer to Richard Vale, the executive who seemed to know everyone worth knowing. Richard was wealthy, polished, and effortlessly charming. He could make an ordinary dinner feel like an exclusive event simply by deciding who belonged at the table. Ethan admired him. Claire did not. There was something about Richard that made her uncomfortable. He listened too closely. He remembered personal details. When he spoke, people leaned toward him. Richard hosted private gatherings at his estate several times a year. Employees arrived with their partners, and the evenings continued long after dinner ended. Claire attended once and spent most of the night feeling as though she had entered a room where everyone else understood rules nobody had explained to her. Afterward, Ethan was enthusiastic. "You should give them another chance. I don't like those people. You barely talk to anyone." "Exactly," he laughed, but Claire noticed the irritation underneath it. Weeks passed. Then invitations began arriving directly for Claire. At first, she assumed Richard had simply been polite. But the messages became more personal. Private dinners, smaller gatherings, conversations Ethan knew nothing about. Claire began deleting them. One evening, she stood in the kitchen with her phone angled away from Ethan. A message appeared. Claire read it, hesitated, and locked the screen. Behind her, Ethan entered the room. "What was that?" She turned too quickly. "Nothing." Ethan looked at the phone in her hand. "Who was messaging you?" Claire forced a smile. "Just someone from work." For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. Then his expression changed. He had noticed the hesitation. And Claire realized that whatever she was hiding had just become the most important thing in their marriage. The hesitation Claire had shown in the kitchen did not end with Ethan's question. If anything, it opened a door she had been afraid to touch. The next invitation from Richard arrived 3 days later. This time, Claire did not delete it. The gathering was smaller than the first one she had attended. There were no crowded tables or loud introductions. Couples sat in comfortable rooms and spoke with startling openness about their marriages, jealousy, attraction, and boundaries. Nothing was treated as shameful. People disagreed without pretending they did not. They laughed about subjects Claire had spent years avoiding. She listened. At first, she felt like an outsider. Then someone asked her what she wanted. Claire almost laughed. Nobody had asked her that in years. At home, every question seemed to begin with what Ethan expected. When would she return? Who had she seen? Why had she changed her plans? What did she want for dinner? Here, people seemed interested in the answer. Richard noticed. He never rushed toward her. Instead, he made himself available whenever she looked uncertain. He poured her another drink. He listened when she spoke. He remembered small details she had mentioned weeks earlier. "You look different when you're here," he told her one evening. Claire looked at him. "Different how?" "Like you're not apologizing for taking up space." The word stayed with her. She began attending more gatherings. At first, she told Ethan that Richard's circle was simply part of his professional world. Ethan disliked it, but his objections were complicated by his dependence on Richard's approval at work. "You don't need to go every time," he said. "I know." "Then don't." Claire looked at him. "Why?" "Because I don't trust them." She almost asked whether he trusted her. Instead, she said nothing. Richard gradually became the person she spoke to when Ethan's behavior upset her. That was where the danger began. He never directly told Claire to leave her husband. He did something more effective. He asked questions. "Do you feel heard at home? Does Ethan let you make decisions? Why are you always afraid of upsetting him?" Claire answered reluctantly at first. Then honestly, Richard listened without judgment. "You deserve to be yourself," he finally told her. "Not the version of you that keeps everyone else comfortable." Claire wanted to believe him. That desire did not make her innocent. She knew she was hiding things from Ethan. She knew she was crossing emotional boundaries. She also knew that Richard enjoyed having her trust, and that his attention was not entirely selfless. Still, loneliness has a way of making warnings sound distant. Claire began dressing differently before the gatherings. She bought clothes Ethan had never seen. She stayed out later. She stopped explaining every detail of her evenings. Ethan noticed all of it. One night, she returned after midnight. He was waiting in the living room with the television turned off. "Who were you with?" Claire removed her coat. "Friends." "Which friends?" She looked at him for several seconds. "People who don't make me feel like I'm doing something wrong for being alive." Ethan's expression hardened. That isn't an answer. No, Claire said quietly. It's the first honest answer I've given you in a long time. She walked upstairs. Ethan remained alone beneath the dark television screen, listening to her footsteps disappear. Neither of them knew it yet, but the marriage had crossed a line, and Richard Vale was waiting on the other side. By morning, the argument had become silence. Ethan went to work without saying goodbye. Claire watched his car disappear through the window, then looked down at her phone. A message from Richard was waiting. Are you coming Friday? She stared. For a moment, she did not feel afraid of what answering might mean. She typed, yes. That answer would bring her closer to the night when secrecy became impossible forever. The answer Claire had given Richard opened a door neither of them could easily close. Over the following weeks, she saw more of his private world. At the office, Richard Vale was almost universally admired. Employees described him as demanding but fair, the kind of executive who remembered birthdays, rewarded loyalty, and could make a junior employee feel important after a 5-minute conversation. He knew which families were struggling, which marriages were failing, and which ambitions could be turned into leverage. Claire eventually understood that his charm was not accidental. Richard collected information. He used it carefully. A compliment here, a favor there, a reminder of what someone owed him. He rarely threatened people directly because he preferred making them believe that cooperating was their own idea. Claire was fascinated and unsettled by that quality. With her, however, he seemed different. At least, that was what she wanted to believe. Their conversations became longer. Richard spoke about freedom, marriage, and the artificial rules people accepted because they were afraid of judgment. You don't have to live like everyone else, he told her one evening. Claire looked away. I know. Do you? She did not answer. By then, she had become comfortable enough in Richard's circle that the gatherings no longer felt strange. They felt private, exclusive, dangerous in a way that made ordinary life seem dull. Then Richard suggested something that made Claire stop breathing. Why don't we host the next one at your house? Claire stared at him. My house. Ethan is away next weekend. That doesn't make it okay. Richard smiled. Who would know? Claire immediately shook her head. No. But the words sounded weaker than she intended. Richard leaned back. Claire, Ethan already spends most of his life somewhere else. Work, meetings, people he needs to impress. You told me yourself that he stopped seeing you years ago. That doesn't mean I can use his house for this. Your house too. She looked at him. Richard lowered his voice. You deserve one night that belongs to you. The sentence stayed with her. That night, Claire walked through her home differently. She noticed the photographs on the walls, the expensive furniture, the dining table where she and Ethan had celebrated anniversaries that now felt like performances. She knew what Richard was asking. She also knew she was considering it. 3 days later, she agreed. The arrangement was kept secret. Richard chose the guests. Claire handled the house. She told Ethan that she planned to spend Friday evening with a friend. His response arrived quickly. Which friend? Claire stared at the screen before typing. Emily. It was a lie. Ethan replied with a simple question. What time will you be home? Claire wrote, late. Then she turned off her phone. Friday arrived. Richard came first, carrying expensive bottles and a confidence that made the house feel suddenly unfamiliar. Then came the others. Couples arrived laughing, dressed for an evening that had nothing to do with ordinary friendship. Music filled the rooms. Glasses were poured. Conversations grew quieter and more intimate as the night deepened. Claire stood in her living room, watching strangers occupy the spaces where her marriage had once felt safe. For one terrible moment, she understood what she had done. She had not simply invited people into her home. She had handed Richard the key to a part of her life that could never be returned unchanged. She knew the secret could destroy everything, yet she stayed, unable to walk away now. And somewhere beyond the closed curtains, the night was already moving toward Ethan's unexpected return. The night had begun with Claire pretending she was comfortable. Music moved through the house, soft at first, then louder as glasses emptied and conversations became less guarded. People drifted between rooms in small groups. Some laughed in the kitchen. Others disappeared upstairs for private conversations. Claire watched everything with a strange distance, as though she were observing someone else's life. Richard remained calm. He seemed to belong everywhere. Whenever Claire looked uncertain, he appeared beside her, offering another drink or a quiet word. His confidence made the gathering feel controlled, even when Claire sensed something slipping beyond her understanding. "You're fine," he told her. Claire nodded, but she wasn't. She had expected excitement. Instead, she felt exposed. Every room carried traces of Ethan: photographs, books, furniture he had chosen. The house seemed to accuse her simply by remaining familiar. Then the doorbell rang again. More guests. Claire forced a smile. Hours passed. Across town, Ethan's business trip ended early. The meeting scheduled for the following morning had been canceled, leaving him with no reason to stay. He decided to drive home that night. He did not call Claire. Perhaps he wanted to surprise her. Perhaps some part of him had already sensed that something was wrong. Near midnight, Ethan turned onto their street. The house looked normal from outside. That lasted until he opened the front door. He heard music, then voices, then laughter. Ethan froze. His eyes dropped to the hallway floor. Shoes. More shoes than belonged in the house. Women's heels stood beside men's dress shoes. A jacket hung from the banister. Someone had left a handbag near the stairs. He slowly closed the door behind him. "Claire." No answer. He moved forward. The music continued. A man's laugh came from somewhere deeper inside the house. Ethan's breathing changed. He walked into the living room and saw strangers holding drinks in the home he had spent years building. The room went silent. One woman lowered her glass. Someone whispered Richard's name. Then Ethan saw him. Richard stood near Claire, close enough that there was no explanation that could make the scene ordinary. Claire turned. Her face drained of color. "Ethan." He looked at her. For several seconds, nobody moved. "What is this?" Claire opened her mouth. "Ethan, listen." He looked around the room. At the people. At the bottles. At Richard. Then back at his wife. "You told me you were with Emily." "I was going to explain." "Explain what?" Richard stepped forward. "Ethan, let's calm down." Ethan's eyes moved toward him. "You don't get to tell me to calm down." Richard raised both hands. "No one wanted this to happen. But you did want this." Claire moved between them. "Please." Ethan looked at her with disbelief. "In our house." Her eyes filled with tears. "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" His voice cracked. "You brought them here." Richard moved toward Claire, but Ethan blocked him. "Stay away from her." "Ethan, you're angry." "Angry?" He laughed once, without humor. "You invited yourself into my home, slept with my wife, and now you want to explain anger to me?" Claire whispered his name. He barely heard her. Everything narrowed to three things: Richard, Claire, and knowledge that life had existed beyond his control. The guests began leaving. Chairs scraped against the floor. Doors opened and slammed. People avoided Ethan's eyes as they hurried outside. Richard remained. Claire begged him to go. He ignored her. "This isn't helping," Richard said. Ethan stepped closer. "You destroyed my marriage." Richard answered quietly. "Your marriage was already broken." The words landed harder than Ethan expected. His face changed. Claire saw it. "Ethan, stop." He turned toward her. The anger that had been gathering for years seemed to rise all at once. She reached for his arm. He pulled away. Then, in one sudden movement, Ethan struck her. Claire stumbled. The room went silent. Richard stared. Ethan stared too. For one suspended second, nobody understood what had happened. Then Claire fell out of sight beside the table. And Ethan realized that the sound he heard next was not the sound of a marriage ending. It was the sound of something far worse beginning. The sound of Claire hitting the floor remained in Ethan's mind long after the room became quiet. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Richard was gone. The remaining guests had disappeared through the front door, leaving behind overturned glasses, abandoned coats, and a silence that seemed impossible after the noise of only moments before. Ethan looked toward Claire. She was not moving. "Claire." He dropped to his knees beside her. His hands shook as he touched her shoulder. "Claire, wake up." There was no response. He checked for breathing, then pulled back, staring at the blood beneath her head. "No." The word came out almost soundlessly. Ethan sat beside her. He did not run. He did not call anyone. He simply remained there, staring at the woman he had loved, hated, feared, and accused for years. In his mind, the explanation was already forming. She had betrayed him. She had lied. She had brought strangers into their home. She had humiliated him with Richard. That was why it happened. At least, that was what Ethan needed to believe. Because if the murder had been caused only by one terrible moment, then perhaps he could understand it. Perhaps he could survive it. But beneath the anger was another truth. Ethan had been losing control long before that night. He had questioned Claire's friendships. He had monitored her movements. He had demanded explanations for ordinary decisions. Every unanswered message had become evidence. Every late arrival had become suspicion. He had called it love. Sometimes he had called it concern. But it had always been fear. Now that fear sat beside him in the form of a dead woman. Outside, sirens approached. A neighbor had called police after hearing the crash and screaming. Officers entered cautiously, expecting an active threat. They found Ethan exactly where he had remained. One officer secured the house, while another checked Claire. The confirmation came quickly. She was dead. Detectives arrived soon afterward and began separating facts from Ethan's fragmented account. He said the confrontation had happened suddenly. He said he saw Claire and Richard together, became overwhelmed, and struck her once. But the scene suggested something different. There were broken glasses in 2 rooms. A chair had been knocked over. A lamp was damaged. A photograph had fallen from the wall. The evidence suggested the argument had moved through the house before ending in the living room. When Detective Hayes questioned Ethan again, she placed his first statement beside the physical evidence. "You said you struck her once." "I did." "Then why is there blood in the hallway?" Ethan looked away. "I don't remember." "Why is the bedroom door broken?" Silence. "Why are there signs that someone tried to leave through the kitchen?" Ethan's jaw tightened. Hayes watched him carefully. She understood that shock could distort memory, but it could also become an excuse. Finally, she asked the question that had been waiting since she entered the house. "Did you kill her because you found her with another man?" Ethan stared at the floor. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he looked toward Claire. "I killed her because I realized she had been living a life without me." Hayes wrote the sentence down. It was not a confession of motive so much as an admission of possession. The investigation widened. Police searched Claire's phone, laptop, and private messages. They expected to find evidence of a single affair. Instead, they found months of conversations with Richard, messages sent late at night, plans made without Ethan's knowledge, private invitations, promises, photographs. The relationship had not begun that evening. Richard had not simply appeared at the house. He had been part of Claire's secret life for months. And as investigators read the messages, one question became impossible to ignore. How long had Ethan suspected the truth before he finally walked through that door, before police ever arrived? The question stayed with Detective Hayes as the investigation moved deeper into Claire's private life. What began as a murder scene quickly became a portrait of a marriage that had been deteriorating long before Ethan opened the front door that night. Claire's phone was the first place they looked. There were hundreds of messages. Some were ordinary, grocery lists, work reminders, appointments, conversations with friends. Others revealed a woman who had spent months trying to explain her unhappiness to herself. She had written about Ethan's jealousy. She had written about feeling watched. She had written about wanting to leave. But she had also written about missing him. That contradiction troubled Hayes. Claire had not simply stopped loving her husband. She seemed to have spent months moving between resentment and affection, freedom and guilt. One message to a friend read, "Sometimes I think I should leave. Then I remember the man he used to be." Another followed weeks later. "I don't know if I hate him or if I'm just tired." Hayes kept reading. Richard appeared repeatedly. His messages were carefully worded. He rarely ordered Claire to do anything. Instead, he encouraged her to question herself. "You know you don't have to accept this. You're allowed to choose yourself. Ethan doesn't get to decide who you are." The words sounded supportive, but taken together, they revealed something else. Richard was gradually positioning himself as the person Claire needed in order to escape Ethan. Then investigators found Ethan's messages. They were different. "Where are you? Who are you with? Why didn't you answer? Send me a picture." Some were angry. Others sounded frightened. Ethan had monitored Claire's movements closely, demanding reassurance whenever she disappeared from his reach. Neither man's behavior looked healthy. One tried to control Claire through suspicion. The other influenced her through validation. Claire seemed caught between them, increasingly uncertain which version of herself was real. Investigators searched financial records next. There were restaurant charges Claire had never mentioned, hotel payments connected to Richard's business account, purchases made on evenings when Claire had told Ethan she was working late. Photographs revealed another layer. Claire appeared in several private gatherings with Richard and his circle. In some, She looked uncomfortable. In others, she was smiling. Hayes studied one photograph for a long time. Claire was standing beside Richard, but her expression was difficult to read. Was she happy? Was she pretending? Or had she simply become accustomed to hiding what she felt? Then technicians recovered deleted messages from Claire's phone. Most were insignificant. One was not. It had been sent shortly before the party began. Tonight has to end something. I just don't know what. Nobody could explain what Claire had meant. Perhaps she intended to leave Ethan. Perhaps she intended to end things with Richard. Perhaps she had planned to walk away from both men and begin again. Or perhaps she had sensed that the secret life she had created was becoming impossible to control. Hayes placed the phone on the table. The murder was no longer a simple story about a jealous husband discovering an affair. Claire had been unhappy before Richard. Richard had encouraged her unhappiness to become dependence. Ethan's jealousy had pushed her further towards secrecy. And Claire, despite understanding the danger, had continued making choices that deepened the conflict. Three people had been pulling the same fragile life in different directions. Only one of them had ended it with violence. Yet as Hayes looked again at Claire's final message, she wondered whether the most important question was not what Claire planned to end that night. It was who else knew she was planning to end something at all. By then, investigators understood that the truth would not be found in a single confession. It was buried inside months of messages, omissions, half-truths, and choices that each person had made behind closed doors. By then, Claire's final message had raised more questions than it answered. Richard's name had already appeared throughout Claire's messages, but now he became the investigation's most important missing piece. By morning, detectives knew he had left the house immediately after the confrontation. Several witnesses remembered seeing him disappear through the front door while Ethan remained inside. Then he began making changes. Messages disappeared from his phone. Conversations with Claire were deleted. Several guests received calls asking what they had seen. One witness was urged to remember that Richard had left before the violence began. It looked less like panic than preparation. He was not merely trying to survive the consequences. He appeared to be shaping the story investigators would eventually hear. When detectives finally located him, Richard appeared composed. "I was protecting myself," he said. Hayes watched him carefully. From Ethan? From anyone who might have blamed me. He insisted he had not touched Claire. He claimed the party had become chaotic and that Ethan's arrival had changed everything. But investigators already knew more. Phone records placed Richard in constant contact with Claire during the weeks before the party. Financial records connected him to private dinners. Photographs showed him attending similar gatherings with other employees and their partners. Richard had not created this world for Claire alone. Some guests described them as harmless social events. Others admitted that boundaries became blurred once the doors closed. Richard encouraged secrecy and made people feel that conventional rules were simply restrictions placed on people who lacked courage. Richard knew it. He had listened to her complaints about Ethan, reinforced her resentment, and presented himself as someone who understood her better than her husband did. When confronted with this, Richard became defensive. "I never forced her to do anything." Hayes nodded. "No, you didn't have to." The sentence silenced him. Richard eventually admitted that he had encouraged Claire to attend the gathering and knew Ethan might react badly if he discovered what was happening. "But I didn't know he would kill her." "That isn't what I asked." Richard looked away. "You knew he was jealous. I knew he was possessive. And you brought Claire into his house anyway." Richard said nothing. The investigators understood the distinction. Knowing a person might become violent was not the same as causing the violence, but remaining silent after recognizing the danger could still carry its own moral weight. Richard's manipulation could explain the circumstances, but it did not erase Ethan's responsibility for Claire's death. Still, Hayes needed to know what Richard had expected when Ethan returned. She placed the photographs on the table. "Claire, Richard, the house." Then she asked quietly, "Did you know what would happen if Ethan came home?" Richard remained silent for several seconds. His confidence finally cracked. "I knew he was capable of losing control." Hayes wrote down the answer. For the first time, Richard understood that his carefully protected image could not survive every question, and that investigators were beginning to separate his influence from Ethan's violence. It was about what everyone had known before the door opened. The answer Richard had given did not close the investigation. It opened another door. Detective Hayes returned to Ethan with a clearer understanding of the night. Richard had manipulated Claire. Claire had hidden the relationship. But none of that explained the moment Ethan raised his hand. Ethan sat across from Hayes in an interview room, looking exhausted. The anger that had filled him at the house was gone. Without it, he looked smaller, almost ordinary. Hayes placed a photograph of Claire on the table. "You said you loved her." "I did." "Then tell me what happened." Ethan stared at the photograph. For several minutes, he said nothing. Finally, he began. He admitted that Claire's betrayal had destroyed something inside him. When he saw her beside Richard, years of suspicion seemed to become real in a single instant. But he also admitted something harder. He had been jealous long before Richard appeared. He had questioned Claire about friends. He had demanded explanations for late nights. He had checked her phone. He had treated independence as evidence that she was pulling away from him. "I thought I was protecting our marriage," he said. Hayes shook her head. "You were controlling it." Ethan lowered his eyes. He knew she was right. The confession became less about the party and more about the years before it. Ethan described arguments he had minimized, accusations he had forgotten, apologies Claire had accepted because she wanted peace. He had convinced himself that fear was love. He had convinced himself that possession was commitment. Then Claire found another world, and Ethan experienced that discovery as a personal destruction. "You didn't just lose your wife that night," Hayes said. "You believed you lost yourself." Ethan looked at her. "Yes." His voice broke. "She didn't belong to me." Hayes waited. Then she asked, "Then why did you act like she did?" Ethan could not answer. His eyes filled with tears. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Because I was afraid." Afraid of what? Of being nothing. He covered his face with both hands. For years, Ethan had measured his identity through the marriage. Being Claire's husband had become more than a relationship. It was the center of how he understood himself. When he saw her with Richard, he did not see Claire as a separate person making choices he hated. He saw humiliation. He saw failure. He saw the collapse of the life he believed he owned. And in that moment, rage became stronger than restraint. The detective left him alone for several minutes. Through the glass, Ethan watched officers move quietly through the corridor, carrying folders and evidence bags. Each ordinary movement made the consequences feel more real. He remembered Claire before the arguments, before the suspicion, before he began confusing love with ownership. He remembered her laughing in the kitchen, driving with the windows down, choosing music he disliked simply because it made her happy. Those memories hurt more than the photographs. "I should have left," Ethan whispered. Hayes heard him. "You should have walked away from the argument," she said. Ethan nodded. He understood that there had been 100 moments when he could have chosen differently. He could have left the house. He could have called police. He could have stepped outside and let the anger pass. He chose none of them. Those choices mattered, but could never bring Claire back again. Hayes pushed a statement toward him. "Did you kill Claire?" Ethan stared at the words. "Yes." The room became quiet. He admitted striking her. He admitted continuing the confrontation after he should have walked away. He admitted that the betrayal had triggered him, but he no longer claimed that it excused him. "I wanted her to hurt because I was hurting." Hayes remained silent. Ethan signed the confession with a trembling hand. Outside the room, investigators began preparing the murder charges. For the first time since Claire died, the story seemed to have an ending. But one question remained unanswered. If Ethan had spent years believing Claire belonged to him, why had Claire remained long enough to disappear into Richard's world? That answer was waiting inside the life she had hidden. The courtroom had begun with a simple question: who killed Claire? By the time the final arguments approached, that question no longer seemed large enough to contain everything that had happened. The evidence still pointed toward Ethan, and no witness could erase the fact that Claire had died during the confrontation with him. But as testimony accumulated, the story behind that moment became impossible to separate from the choices, secrets, and manipulations that had surrounded the marriage for months. Richard was questioned again, this time with less room to hide behind charm and carefully chosen explanations. Messages, private conversations, and testimony from people who had watched him interact with Claire revealed a pattern. He had encouraged emotional dependence while keeping his own intentions deliberately unclear. He knew about the tension inside the marriage, understood that Ethan was becoming suspicious, and still continued to push Claire toward decisions that benefited him. His manipulation did not make him responsible for Claire's death, but it destroyed the image of an innocent friend who had simply become involved by accident. Then came Ethan's own secrets. Friends described his jealousy, his demands for constant reassurance, and the way his fear of losing Claire had gradually become possessiveness. What he had called devotion increasingly looked like control. The prosecution used those details to show that the final confrontation was not an isolated explosion, but the culmination of behavior that had been building for a long time. Claire, too, was no longer presented as merely a silent victim of circumstances. Her secrecy was examined carefully. She had hidden the affair, lied about meetings, and continued the relationship while knowing that the marriage was already unstable. Her betrayal had consequences, and those consequences mattered to understanding the emotional chain of events. Yet the judge repeatedly reminded everyone of the boundary that could not be crossed. Betrayal could explain conflict, but it could never justify killing. The party guests became essential to that distinction. One by one, they were asked what they had noticed that night and what they had suspected beforehand. Some remembered arguments that had been dismissed as ordinary marital tension. Others admitted seeing Claire and Richard together and choosing not to interfere. A few had sensed that Ethan was unraveling but assumed someone else would step in. Their testimony revealed something deeply uncomfortable. The warning signs had not appeared all at once. They had been scattered among conversations, glances, rumors, and moments that each person considered too small to matter. The prosecution seized on that history. Ethan, they argued, had crossed a line deliberately. His anger might have been understandable, his humiliation might have been real, and his emotional state might have been severe, but none of those facts changed the essential act. Claire was dead, and Ethan had caused her death. The state urged the jury not to confuse explanation with excuse. The defense offered a different picture. They described a man whose understanding of his marriage collapsed in a single devastating confrontation. They emphasized betrayal, emotional shock, confusion, and psychological collapse. They argued that Ethan had not entered the moment as a cold and calculating killer. He had been overwhelmed by revelations that shattered the life he believed he knew. But the narration of the case refused to choose between two comforting extremes. Ethan's pain was real, but pain did not make violence acceptable. Claire's affair was real, but an affair did not make her deserving of death. Richard's manipulation was real, but manipulation did not make him the murderer. Each truth could exist beside the others without becoming a justification for the final act. That was what made the case so difficult for everyone listening. Responsibility existed on several levels, but it was not equally distributed. People could contribute to a toxic situation without becoming responsible for the ultimate violence. Silence could allow danger to grow without becoming the same thing as causing a death. Betrayal could destroy trust without giving anyone permission to respond with violence. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom seemed strangely smaller than it had before. Ethan was convicted. The verdict did not erase the affair, the manipulation, the arguments, or the failures of the people who had watched the marriage deteriorate. It established one clear responsibility. Ethan was accountable for Claire's death. Richard escaped murder charges, but the consequences did not disappear. Civil investigations followed, along with professional scrutiny that forced his conduct into public view. The image he had protected for so long became difficult to maintain. His actions had not made him the killer, but they had consequences of their own. And perhaps the most painful revelation came after the verdict, when the story was viewed from a distance. The marriage that had appeared polished and stable to friends and outsiders had been collapsing long before Claire died. The final night had not created every problem. It had exposed them. For the people left behind, that distinction offered no comfort. There had been opportunities to speak, moments when someone might have questioned what was happening, and warning signs that seemed obvious only after everything was over. The tragedy was not that one secret had suddenly destroyed a perfect marriage. It was that the marriage had been breaking quietly, piece by piece, while everyone around it kept believing there would be time to fix what was already becoming impossible to repair. That question followed every witness beyond the courthouse doors. It lingered in the silence of Claire's empty home, in the messages that would never receive another reply, and in the memories of friends who now replayed moments with painful clarity. They had thought they were watching a troubled relationship. Only afterward did they understand that they had been watching a warning unfold, and that understanding arrived far too late to change the ending. And as the courtroom emptied, One question remained unanswered, not about who was guilty, but about what could have happened if someone had recognized the warning signs before the final confrontation ever began. Months later, the house stands empty, but the silence inside it carries the weight of everything that happened there. The furniture has been removed, the photographs taken down, and the walls repainted in an attempt to make the rooms look ordinary again. Yet no amount of fresh paint can separate the address from the night Claire died. For everyone who knew the story, the house remains less a home than a permanent reminder of the moment when secrets became consequences. Outside, the neighborhood has continued moving. Cars pass the property. Lights appear in nearby windows. People go to work, children return from school, and life continues with the indifference it always seems to have after tragedy. But inside the empty house, there is nothing left to distract from memory. Ethan has received a lengthy prison sentence. The courtroom is behind him now, but the verdict has not changed the reality waiting for him. His future has been reduced to years measured by concrete walls, scheduled hours, and memories of the choices that brought him there. Whatever he once believed he was protecting, he can no longer recover it. Claire is gone, the marriage is gone, and the life he thought he knew exists only in fragments. Richard's consequences take a different form. He avoids a murder conviction, but his position disappears, followed by the social standing he once considered secure. People who once welcomed him into their homes become distant. Conversations stop when he enters a room. His name becomes associated with manipulation, secrecy, and the chain of events that surrounded Claire's death. Legally, he is not the murderer. Socially, however, the consequences are severe. For Claire's family, the grief is more complicated than anger alone can explain. They mourn a daughter, sister, and loved one whose final choices left painful questions behind. They cannot pretend the affair never happened, nor can they erase the secrecy that surrounded it. Some memories are difficult to hold without disappointment. Yet none of those choices change the simplest truth. Claire did not deserve to die. That distinction becomes part of their mourning. They are allowed to remember her flaws without turning those flaws into an explanation for her death. They are allowed to be angry with her and still miss her. They are allowed to wish she had made different choices while understanding that the responsibility for the violence belonged to the person who committed it. As months pass, the public attention fades. The headlines disappear from screens. The courtroom photographs become old images. People who once followed every detail of the trial move on to other stories. But those closest to Claire discover that grief does not follow the same schedule as public interest. Ordinary moments become reminders. A song, a photograph, an unanswered message, or a familiar holiday can suddenly reopen memories that never truly disappeared. Eventually, the story returns to the house. The living room where the party once filled the space with music, conversation, laughter, and hidden tension is now completely silent. There are no guests gathered around the room. No glasses sit on the tables. No voices compete for attention. Nothing remains except walls, windows, and the memory of what happened there. And from that silence comes the question that has followed the entire case. Was Claire killed because of the party? Was it the affair? Was it Richard's manipulation? Was it Ethan's jealousy? Each explanation contains part of the truth, but none of them tells the whole story. The darker answer is that the murder was not created in a single night. The night only exposed everything that had already been broken. The marriage had been damaged by secrecy before the party began. Trust had been weakened by betrayal. Richard had added manipulation to an already unstable situation. Ethan's jealousy had grown beyond ordinary hurt and become something more dangerous. Friends had noticed pieces of the problem, but failed to understand how close everything was to collapse. None of those facts erase Ethan's responsibility. They simply explain why the final night carried so much emotional pressure. A tragedy can have many contributing circumstances without having many people equally responsible for the final act. That is what makes the empty house so haunting. Nothing about its walls can explain why one person chose violence. Nothing inside it can tell Claire's family what she might have done differently. Nothing can tell the guests whether speaking sooner would have changed anything. The house offers no answers. It only preserves the place where every unresolved problem finally collided. In the final image, attention settles on the front door. It is the same door Ethan opened when he came home. The same door through which the guests hurried away when the night became unbearable. The same doorway that once separated the house from the ordinary world outside. And it is the same door Claire never walked through again. The camera remains there for a moment, holding on the quiet entrance as daylight fades beyond the windows. There is no final revelation, no hidden confession, and no sudden twist waiting behind the silence. There is only the understanding that some endings cannot be repaired because they were created by choices that could not be undone. The house remains standing, but the life that once filled it is gone. Its rooms have been cleaned, its walls have been changed, and its furniture has disappeared. Yet memory has left something behind that paint cannot cover. The story began with a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. It ends with an empty house that proves appearances can conceal damage for far longer than anyone realizes. For those who remain, uncertainty becomes part of the grief, because warning signs are easier to recognize after tragedy than before it. And when the door finally disappears into darkness, the question is no longer who should have seen the ending coming. It is whether anyone could have stopped it before the broken pieces became impossible to put back together.